On the eve of his hanging, when the town had gone quiet and even the saloon lamps burned low as if ashamed to shine, Caleb Rourke sat alone beneath the unfinished gallows with a blanket around his shoulders and a lantern placed a careful distance away, its flame breathing softly with the wind, and as that wind moved through the ropes above him it made a sound like distant voices, the kind that carry memory more than meaning, and Caleb, once called a terror of the territory and whispered about in fearful tones from river towns to desert crossings, began to speak, not loudly and not to anyone in particular, but to the night itself, because the night had followed him longer than any man, and if he was to leave this world by morning, he wanted at least one truth to step out of the dark with him, and so he told the wind that his name had not always been cursed, that once it had been spoken gently by a woman who believed in better endings, and that before the blood and the running and the long years of being hunted, there had been a boy who believed the world might make room for him if he worked hard and kept his word, a boy who learned early how fragile peace could be when the land was wide and the law arrived late, and as Caleb spoke his voice wavered not from fear of the rope but from the weight of memory, because the story the world told about him was simpler than the truth, cleaner in a way that allowed people to sleep, while the real story was tangled with choices made in hunger and fear, with promises broken not out of cruelty but desperation, and with love that arrived at the wrong time and refused to leave even when it should have, and he confessed that the first man he ever hurt was not a stranger in a gunfight but himself, when he chose silence instead of speaking the truth to the one person who could have changed his path, and as the lantern flickered he admitted that the robbery that made him infamous had not been planned as legend claimed, that it had been a rescue turned wrong, an attempt to buy freedom for someone else at the cost of his own, and the shots that followed were chaos not courage, fear not pride, and though the papers later painted him as smiling and fearless, he remembered shaking hands and a prayer whispered so fast it barely sounded like words, and he told the night how the face that haunted him most was not the sheriff he outdrew but the young deputy who looked at him with surprise more than anger, as if trying to understand how a man became a moment he could never step out of, and the wind pressed closer then, tugging at the gallows beam, and Caleb leaned back against the rough wood and continued, because the secret he carried was not about how many men he had faced or how far he had run, but about why he stopped running at all, and he confessed that years ago, in a small valley hidden from main roads, he had left behind a life he could never return to, a life where his name was not feared but spoken softly at the end of long days, where a woman waited with quiet strength and eyes that saw through his worst parts without turning away, and that he had walked away not because he did not love her but because he did, because staying would have pulled her into the storm that followed him like a shadow, and he told the night that every crime he committed after that choice felt heavier than the last, not because the stakes were higher but because the reason was gone, and as the hours crept forward and the stars shifted, Caleb admitted that the legend of the outlaw was built by men who needed a villain and by himself when he stopped correcting them, because wearing the mask was easier than explaining the truth, easier than admitting regret, and he spoke of nights on the trail when he helped strangers without revealing his name, of money left where it would be found, of letters written and never sent, and he confessed that the greatest lie ever told about him was that he did not care. Because caring was the one thing he never managed to outrun, and now, with the rope waiting and the town asleep, he said the secret plainly at last, that the man they planned to hang in the morning had once turned himself in under a false name to save another from the same fate, that the blood-soaked legend rested on a sacrifice no one knew about, and that the woman he loved had lived a full life believing him dead, which was the mercy he chose for her even as it broke him, and the wind seemed to still for a moment as if listening, and Caleb lowered his head and smiled faintly, not in triumph but in acceptance, because whether the world believed his confession or not no longer mattered, only that it existed somewhere beyond him, carried by the night, and as the lantern dimmed and the gallows creaked softly overhead, he finished with a final truth spoken barely above a breath, that if the Wild West was written in blood it was also written in quiet moments no one saw, in choices made alone, and in hearts that kept beating even when the world decided their story was already finished. No one remembered exactly when Eliza Moran first arrived in Red Mesa, only that one summer morning the dust on the road had barely settled before her name began moving through the town like a warning carried on the heat, spoken low in the general store, half swallowed in the saloon, passed from porch to porch with the same careful tone used for storms and sickness, because Eliza Moran was known as the widow of Red Mesa, and every man who had ever loved her was said to have met a violent end, shot in ambush, dragged into a duel, or swallowed whole by the lawless spaces between towns. And though no one could say for certain whether the curse was real or simply a story grown sharp with retelling, the effect was the same, for men tipped their hats and kept their distance, and women watched her with a mix of pity and quiet fear, and Eliza herself moved through the town as though she had learned long ago how to carry grief without letting it bend her spine, tall and composed, dressed always in dark, practical clothes softened only by the way she touched things gently, the way she spoke to children and animals as if they were fragile and deserving of patience, and she lived alone at the edge of town in a small adobe house pressed up against the desert, where the land stretched wide and unforgiving and the sun ruled every hour, and it was there, on an afternoon when the heat shimmered so hard it blurred the horizon, that fate came to her door in the shape of a man who should not have been able to walk that far, a gunslinger named Thomas Hale who collapsed against her threshold with blood darkening his shirt and dust caked in his hair, and Eliza, hearing the sound and opening the door, did not scream or call for help, but knelt beside him with steady hands, because she had seen wounded men before and learned that panic wasted precious moments, and as she dragged him inside inch by inch, unaware of his name or the trouble stitched into his past, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever the world placed another broken soul in her care, and Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness for days while Eliza cleaned the wound in his side and fed him water with a spoon, and when he woke fully at last, he looked at her as though she were something he had dreamed up to survive the pain, and she told him only that he was safe for now and that Red Mesa was a small town where questions were asked slowly and answers often came too late, and Thomas, sensing the boundaries in her voice, did not press, because he too carried a history better left untouched, and as days passed the heat eased and the desert evenings grew cooler, and they fell into a quiet rhythm, sharing meals, sharing silence, learning the shape of each other's presence without demanding more, and Eliza noticed the way Thomas moved carefully, as if he expected the world to turn on him without warning, and Thomas noticed how Eliza sometimes stared at the horizon at dusk with an expression that was not quite sorrow and not quite hope, but something caught between, and slowly, almost against their will, something gentle began to form, not the reckless passion of stories but a fragile trust built in small moments, in the way Thomas fixed the loose shutter without being asked, in the way Eliza laughed softly at something he said and then seemed surprised by the sound of it, and yet the town watched, because Red Mesa never missed a shift in its own balance, and whispers followed Thomas wherever he went, whispers that reached Eliza whether she wanted them to or not, reminders of the men who had come before, of the graves scattered across the territory like punctuation marks in her life, and Eliza told herself that this time would be different only in that she would not let herself hope, because hope had always been the sharpest blade, and Thomas, sensing the wall she kept carefully in place, struggled with his own growing attachment, knowing that men like him did not bring peace with them, only danger delayed, and when he finally learned her name spoken in the saloon one evening, followed by uneasy laughter and silence, he returned to the house with his heart heavy, understanding at last why kindness clung to her like a bruise beneath the skin, and they spoke then, honestly but quietly, of the things they had lost and the things they feared, and Eliza did not deny the stories, only said that loving her had never been what killed those men, that the world they lived in simply did not spare anyone for long, and Thomas admitted that trouble followed him like a shadow, that there were men who might still be looking for him, and in that admission the fragile shape of their bond trembled, because love in the West was never just between two people, but between two pasts that refused to stay buried, and though neither spoke the word goodbye, it hovered between them in the days that followed, and when violence finally came to Red Mesa, sudden and sharp as summer lightning, it confirmed every fear Eliza had ever carried, for men arrived at the edge of town, asking questions, their eyes finding Thomas too easily, and that night, as the desert wind rattled the windows, Thomas told Eliza he would leave before dawn, not because he did not care, but because caring was exactly why he could not stay, and Eliza listened without tears, because she had learned how to keep them for later, and when morning came, painted pale and cruelly beautiful, Thomas stood at her door and hesitated, wanting to say something that would make the leaving hurt less, but knowing such words did not exist, and Eliza placed her hand briefly over his, a touch light but steady, and said only that she hoped the road would be kinder to him than it had been to others, and as he walked away, she watched until he became a small figure swallowed by the land, and for a long time afterward she stood there, feeling the familiar ache settle back into its place, believing the story had ended as it always did, and yet weeks later, when the town received word of a gunfight miles away, and men spoke confidently of another death to add to her legend, Eliza felt something different, not grief but uncertainty, because deep down she knew that some bonds did not break cleanly, that some love stories did not end with bodies or blood but with absence and unanswered questions, and as the seasons shifted and Red Mesa continued its quiet existence under the burning sun, Eliza carried on, still watched, still whispered about, but changed in a way no one could name, because somewhere beyond the horizon a man she had loved was still breathing, still remembering her, and that knowledge, painful and precious all at once, became both her burden and her hope, proving that even in a land written with tragedy, fate sometimes chose not to finish the story where everyone expected it to end. Deadwood Crossing had the look of a place the world had forgotten on purpose, its buildings slumped and sun-bleached, its main street scarred by wagon ruts that never quite filled back in, and when the lone rider appeared at the edge of town one late afternoon, most folks barely glanced up, because riders came and went but trouble stayed, and this man, bent slightly in the saddle and moving like someone who measured every step against old pain, did not look like trouble so much as something trouble had already chewed up and spat back out, and yet when he dismounted in front of the empty sheriff's office and the light caught the badge pinned to his coat, tarnished and worn thin at the edges, a hush spread that felt heavier than gun smoke, because Deadwood Crossing had not seen law in years. Not since the night everything went wrong, and the man wearing that badge was Silas Boone, a name that still carried weight whether people wanted it to or not, and Silas had not planned on stopping there, had not planned on wearing the badge again at all, but the horse had gone lame and his body, stiff with old injuries and older regret, had demanded rest whether his pride allowed it or not, and as he leaned against the hitching post and let the town look its fill, memories pressed in uninvited. Because Deadwood Crossing was where he had failed once before, where wearing the law had cost him more than it ever gave back, and the wind that moved through the street now sounded too much like the night screams that had driven him away years ago, and he would have turned right back around if the place had not been exactly as he remembered it, broken and waiting, with no marshal and no protection, and trouble crouched just beyond the hills like a patient animal, and by nightfall word had spread fast enough that Silas Boone was back, or at least a version of him, and people came out cautious, eyes sharp with hope they did not want to admit to, and Silas answered no questions, took a room above the livery, and sat alone with the badge in his hands, tracing the scratches that marked every poor decision he had ever made, because this badge had once belonged to his brother, and wearing it now felt like reopening a wound that had never healed right, and the town itself seemed to sense the tension, because before dawn Silas was woken by raised voices and the sound of boots in the street, and when he stepped outside he saw the men he had half expected and fully dreaded, riders flying the colors of the Calder gang, men who had turned Deadwood Crossing into a toll booth for violence and fear, men who had been part of the night Silas failed to stop, and the leader, Grant Calder himself, smiled slow and thin when he saw the badge, because history was a story he enjoyed repeating, and Silas felt the weight of every eye on him as Calder spoke, asking whether the town had finally found itself another fool willing to die for it, and Silas answered only that Deadwood Crossing was not Calder's, not today, and the laugh that followed was loud and careless, but it did not quite hide the flicker of recognition in Calder's eyes, because he remembered Silas Boone too, remembered the marshal who had hesitated once, just once, and paid for it with blood, and as Calder rode off with a promise to return in force, the town gathered around Silas in a tight, uncertain knot, asking what he planned to do, and Silas surprised himself by saying he planned to stay, because leaving again felt worse than the fear settling into his bones, and the days that followed were heavy with preparation, because war, when it came, was never sudden, and Silas walked the streets with a limp that grew worse by evening, teaching those willing to listen how to stand their ground, how to watch corners and count footsteps, and at night he sat alone with his memories, because the ghosts were loudest when the work was done, and he saw again the night his brother fell, saw himself frozen between two choices, saw the instant where courage failed him and the law failed with him, and it was that failure that had driven him away, that had made him bury the badge and swear never to wear it again, until now, when the town needed someone stubborn enough to try, and as the Calder gang drew closer, fear sharpened into resolve, and Silas felt something inside him straighten, not hope exactly, but acceptance, because he understood now that the past could not be outrun, only faced, and when the gang finally rode in under a hard sun, guns ready and numbers heavy, Deadwood Crossing did not scatter the way it once had, because Silas stood in the street, alone but unbowed, and spoke to Calder with a calm that came from having nothing left to lose, and when the shooting started, it was quick and brutal and loud enough to shake the windows, but Silas moved through it with a clarity he had never known before, not reckless, not fearless, but honest, making choices without hesitation, because hesitation had already taken everything it could from him, and when it was over, the street was torn up and silent, and Grant Calder lay wounded and captured instead of dead, because Silas chose justice where vengeance would have been easier, and as the dust settled and the town breathed again, Silas felt the ache in his body deepen, But the ache in his chest eased just slightly, because this time he had not turned away, and the people of Deadwood Crossing looked at him not as a legend or a savior but as a man who stayed, and that, Silas realized as he removed the badge that night and set it carefully on the table, was the only kind of law that ever truly mattered, the kind worn not out of pride or punishment, but out of quiet responsibility to stand where others could not, even when the ghost stood there too. Black Canyon lay cut deep into the earth like an old wound that never healed, its walls steep and shadowed even at midday, and everyone who lived within 100 miles knew its name and avoided it, because the canyon carried stories older than fences and towns, stories whispered around low fires and quickly changed subject, stories about a vein of gold hidden so well it seemed to breathe, gold said to be marked by the devil himself, and when Nathaniel Crow first came into possession of the map, he did not believe any of it, because belief was a luxury for men who were not starving, and Nathaniel was desperate in the quiet, grinding way that came from watching hope dry up one day at a time, his claim long exhausted, his hands cracked and bleeding, his future narrowed down to a single question of whether he would survive the winter. And the map came to him not in some dramatic exchange but folded inside an old Bible he bought for pennies from a dying preacher who gripped his wrist and whispered only one thing before letting go, that some paths were marked not to guide but to test, and Nathaniel, shaken but practical, told himself it was the rambling of a man already halfway gone, and yet when he opened the book later by lantern light and saw the careful ink lines, the symbols older than any survey mark he knew, and the words Black Canyon written in a hand that trembled as if reluctant, something stirred in him that felt like hope wearing a stranger's face, and so he packed his mule and followed the map west, telling no one, because greed was quieter when kept private, and at first the journey was only hard in the ordinary ways, the sun unforgiving, the nights cold enough to make bones ache, but somewhere past the salt flats the whispers began, faint at first and easily blamed on wind and fatigue, soft sounds at the edge of hearing that spoke his name though no one was there, and Nathaniel told himself that loneliness did strange things to the mind, because acknowledging anything else would mean turning back, and turning back meant accepting that this thin piece of paper was not salvation but another lie, and as the land grew harsher and the canyon walls finally rose ahead of him like a dark promise, the whispers grew clearer, no longer random but coaxing, offering reassurances in a voice that sounded unsettlingly familiar, like his own thoughts spoken aloud, reminding him of the hunger he had known, of the way men looked through him when he asked for work, of the nights he dreamed of striking it rich and waking with nothing but dust on his tongue, and the voice told him that all of that could end if he only followed the map to its end, and when Nathaniel entered Black Canyon proper, the air changed, cooler but heavy, as if the place itself were holding its breath, and the rock walls pressed close, blocking the sky until daylight felt like something rationed, and he noticed strange markings carved into the stone, symbols worn smooth by time, warnings or prayers he could not tell, and his mule grew restless, refusing to move forward at times, eyes rolling white. And Nathaniel had to coax it on with words that felt thin even to him, and that night, camped beneath a twisted juniper, the whispers came closer than ever, circling the firelight without stepping into it, and the voice spoke not of gold but of choice, of how every man paid for what he wanted one way or another, and Nathaniel snapped back at the darkness that he had already paid enough, that he had given his youth and his strength and his faith to a world that returned nothing, and the voice seemed to smile at that, because bitterness, it said, was the easiest currency of all, and when he finally reached the place marked on the map, a narrow cleft hidden behind a curtain of rockfall, Nathaniel felt both triumph and dread, because the gold was there exactly as promised, threads of it catching what little light reached the canyon floor, glowing warm and beautiful and utterly wrong, and as he chipped at the vein his hands shook not from effort but from the feeling that he was being watched, and with every piece of gold he freed, the whispers grew more demanding, less gentle, reminding him of the preacher's words, of all the men who had vanished chasing rumors of Black Canyon, and it was then that Nathaniel understood the price had never been blood or soul in the way stories like to dramatize, but something quieter and crueler, because the gold did not curse men with sudden death but with obsession, with the slow surrender of everything else that made life worth living, and he saw in his mind the future the canyon offered him. Years spent guarding this secret, mistrusting every shadow, turning away from people because sharing meant risking the gold, until he became another whisper himself, another warning no one listened to, and the realization broke through the hunger that had driven him there, and for the first time since finding the map, Nathaniel stopped and listened not to the voices but to the silence beneath them, the silence that felt like the canyon waiting to see what kind of man he would be, and with shaking hands he gathered only a small amount of gold, enough to start again but not enough to chain him, and he did something the voice did not expect, because he left the rest untouched, and as he backed out of the cleft the whispers rose in anger, promising regret and ruin, but they weakened with every step he took away, fading into echoes that belonged more to the canyon than to him, and the journey out was no easier, but it felt lighter, as if some unseen weight had been set down, and when Nathaniel finally emerged into open land with the sky wide above him, he did not look back, because some places did not need witnesses, and years later, when he told the story only in pieces to those who asked how he survived when so many did not, he never claimed to have beaten the devil or broken a curse, only that Black Canyon offered him exactly what he asked for and demanded exactly what he was willing to give, and that in the end the true danger of the West was never the gold hidden in dark places, but the quiet voice inside every man that whispered how easy it would be to give up everything else for just a little more.